the city of, or excuse me, the county, Pima County is taking part in a countywide iNaturalist event at the end of the month called the City Nature Challenge. So just by way of introduction, my name is Margaret Wilch. I'm the Director of Research at SARSEF, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Rebecca Lipson. I've known Rebecca as a colleague, a co-teacher in PUSD for many years, and we both have moved on sort of on parallel tracks since. And so Rebecca, you want to go ahead and explain more? You wear so many hats. I think you're better at saying what you do.
Absolutely. So thank you, Margaret. And yeah, I've been in a lot of different roles, from teaching in the classroom, primarily at the middle school level, to running the UA High School, which is the K-12 outreach program in the Department of Astronomy at the University of Arizona. And now actually I'm more involved with undergraduate research and internship programs at the U of A. And so a lot of different things throughout my educational career. But here today, I'm actually here as part of the Pima County Master Naturalist program. So the Pima County Master Naturalists are an all-volunteer program of folks who really just have a commitment to getting people connected to nature and learning about this wonderful place that we live in and all of the different things that we can experience around us. And so the City Nature Challenge is actually organized locally by the Pima County Master Naturalists. And it's an effort that is a global effort. So this BioBlitz that's coming up at the end of April, and here I'll show you our Master Naturalist website here that has information about the City Nature Challenge. I'll put this link in the chat in just a moment. But the dates are April 29th through May 2nd is the observation window within iNaturalist to be able to add your observations to this global project, really to document biodiversity across the globe, particularly in urban areas, right? We often don't acknowledge the wide diversity of things living right outside in our backyards or in our parks all around us in these urban areas. There's a second section of the City Nature Challenge that focuses really on identification and helping to confirm the observations. And, you know, we may have a lot of first-time users on iNaturalist that need a little bit of help classifying their observations, and certainly none of us have the expertise to really catalog every single thing that we see. So it really takes the community to be able to confirm these observations, and especially to get them to research grade, so that folks like our presenters here today can actually utilize that data in research. So you can feel free to check out the City Nature Challenge page for Pima County. I know Maricopa County is also participating in the City Nature Challenge, and they have their own project page set up. So visit here, get information. There are a number of different events, including 2 more events hosted by SARSEF in the upcoming couple of weeks before the challenge. And then you can also see a list of all of the community partners that we've involved in the City Nature Challenge, and please support them as well. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Margaret to be able to introduce our speakers tonight.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight, because as Director of Research at SARSEF, SARSEF works to connect students and teachers with authentic science experiences. And one of the things that we sponsor is the annual the annual SARSEF Regional Science and Engineering Fair. So our guests tonight are part of the STAR Lab, which is another program that SARSEF runs for high school students ages 16 years or 16 years of age and older. And we match our students with volunteer mentors. So we have a pair. We have Dr. Molly Hunter, who is an associate research professor at the University of Arizona in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, and she studies wildfires. And she is what is known as one of our STAR mentors, and she was paired and matched with a fabulous student named Isabel Ross, who was with us last year in Star Labs as well. She's a senior at Cienega. She's a really amazing thinker and a great scientist. I know from last year and this year, she's dedicated herself to doing authentic science in the areas of natural resources and the environment. So last year she studied green infrastructure, and this year she's looking at the impact of the wildfires on local ecology. So they'll be your presenters for this first session, which is focused on how to use research how to use iNaturalist to do authentic research. So Isabel and Molly, take it away. Thank you.
I can get this up and running. All right. Hopefully this works.
Looks good. No.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Welch, for your introduction. And like she mentioned, my project through the Star Lab for SARSEF this year was the effects of the Bighorn wildfire on wildlife in the Santa Catalinas, particularly bird species. Doesn't want to work for me now. There we go. Here's a little background on the Santa Catalina Mountains. It's a popular tourist destination. They're kind of hard to miss. And they're also just iconic for Tucsonans. I myself am a native Tucsonan. I've lived here my whole life. And it's just a really good spot for natives to go hike, as well as tourists to come and look at our wonderful biodiversity. There are several species found in our desert that aren't found anywhere else in the world. So it's really important to protect these species and this environment. One threat to the biodiversity of the Santa Catalinas was the Bighorn Fire, which burned in the summer of 2020, and it destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres. This top right photo shows the aftermath of the Bighorn Fire. One of the reasons this fire was so devastating was because the Aspen Fire burned almost the exact same area in 2003, and 17 years is a rather short time period for two major wildfires to hit the same spot, meaning that this could be really damaging for this ecosystem. One huge element of wildfires is fire suppression, also known as firefighting. While human suppression can protect property, there were no buildings lost in the Bighorn Fire. It affects the environment by either extinguishing the fire altogether or changing the path of the fire, because the land and the species here actually need that fire to survive and to thrive in that area. However, because the Bighorn Fire was so recent, there has not been extensive research done on that wildfire and its effects, which is where I come in. I specifically decided to focus on bird species in this project, one, because there was just an extraordinary amount of data on it. Like I mentioned before, there are a ton of bird watchers in Arizona, either native or tourists that come to our beloved Santa Catalinas. And so there was a lot of data available on bird species and observations on them. In addition, bird species tend to be easier to identify. It's easier to tell the difference between, say, a warbler and a hawk than maybe different kinds of lizards, which a lot of people aren't as familiar with. Meaning that I got some stronger data as well for using bird species. And here's where iNaturalist comes in. iNaturalist was a source for pretty much all of my data. It is a citizen science database, meaning that regular people go out, not necessarily scientists, and log the things that they see. And they upload pictures or videos of the species that they find, and that gets verified through iNaturalist. And I use the observations labeled up to research grade in my project to make sure that those observations were verifiable and were, that's what I'm looking for, were useful in this research. This picture on the left is what iNaturalist looked like when I was doing my research. I filtered by location, type of species, and time period. I looked from 2020 to 2021 outside of the Bighorn Fire. And I logged all of these observations in a spreadsheet like the one shown on the right, counting each of the species identified by the public. Because I found so many bird species, I ended up with about 48, which is almost impossible to view and draw conclusions from. I stratified my data by habitat, nesting, and behavior using the Cornell Labs All About Birds site. I did not use food or the conservation because I didn't really want much overlap. For these species, I really wanted to see some different trends. And this is what the iNaturalist data gave me for the different behavior stratifications. The blue line here represents when the fire hit, and obviously you see a variety of trends. We're really looking for this parabolic trend where we have the pre-fire observation numbers, which we expected to decrease after the fire because the entire environment was affected. But we are hoping to see this increase back up again, as it's been almost 2 years now since the fire hit, and we're hoping to see those species recovering. This is the graph for the habitat stratification. It looks similar. There are a couple different trends that we see, such as these somewhat cyclical trends, seeing just higher numbers in the spring versus lower numbers in the fall, which makes it difficult to differentiate whether this was due to the fire or due to natural seasonal trends, as well as some trends here where there's very little data available for those types of birds in the Catalinas, just because they're not very common. We didn't have many observations of those in iNaturalist. This is the last stratification, the nesting stratification. And again, we see some parabolic trends, some inconclusive trends, and we also see this just downward trend where we have observations cut by more than half, and it hasn't really gone up to the pre-fire levels, which could be concerning for the birds that fall into this category. Here's an overview of those trends. We have the parabolic, which generally means good news. We are seeing our ecosystem recover. We have some troubling ones where it decreased and has yet to come back up, which needs some further observation to see if in the few months since this project was finalized, they've recovered, or see in the future if they will be doing better. And then we have some inconclusive results, including the cyclical trends and the ones with just very little data. As a result of this, I plan to continue using iNaturalist to further the research, looking at additional time periods, both past and present, to really identify those cyclical or seasonal trends, as well as comparing it to different locations. iNaturalist looks all over the world, so I want to look at the Bighorn Mountains, which have a similar biodiversity to the Santa Catalinas, but did not burn. And so I hope to compare the observations from those two regions. In general, we're seeing some good things. The citizen return to the Catalinas, getting more data inputted into iNaturalist since the fire, shows that our Catalinas will be coming back, back in full swing. But however, there was not much research on the fire suppression techniques in the area, or exactly where these firefighters were. I want to look at more specifically where these observations were, not just as a Catalinas as a whole, in order to really see how firefighting affected these species. All right. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I'm going to give you a big round of applause here with my little reactions. I hope we all join in. It was really wonderful to hear your presentation. The plan was for Molly and you to answer questions, and maybe Molly could if you have anything to add that you want to expand from your perspective of working with Isabel on the data set and how you guys, maybe you could sort of talk about the decisions you made in what data to use. And then certainly we want to open the floor up to questions from our audience. So.
Sure, I could just offer up that, this was my first use of any kind of citizen science database, and first time advising a high school student in a project like this. And the more we got into it and explored it, it kind of awe-inspired me with the possibilities that are afforded to us with exploring some of these data sets. And particularly for high school students, because, Isabel and I, of course, it's pandemic world, so we were meeting remotely, but even outside of that, Isabel lives very far from the university. And so, being able to meet in person would be very difficult. Being able to get out in the field and collect data would be extremely difficult. And so this resource just opened up an enormous opportunity for, looking at all kinds of different questions. And so I think we had a lot to work with. And, and I think about this I work a lot with an agency that funds scientific studies, research, and, what it would take to answer this kind of question in kind of our traditional setting of, putting out a competitive call for proposals and funding an expert and having them go out and collect data. First of all, it would take years to get that off the ground. It would take, I don't even know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars. And here, with Isabel and her amazing skills at kind of downloading and looking at data, she's able to address some of those questions. So I found it really fun and exciting.
That's awesome. That's it's wonderful that this was also your first adventure using citizen science. And as you said, like, it's all there and you don't have to write a grant. You don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars or hundreds of people hours out in the field, because you've already got it, because the people have already been there, right? Yeah. I'm wondering, Isabel, did you and Molly, did you have to make some decisions about what data to use or how to use the data? What was your experience just using iNaturalist? I have a dog that wants in, so I'll.
Yeah, of course. iNaturalist has so much data. There were, it's kind of why I have a very long list of things I'm going to do next with it, because there's just so much, so many opportunities there. I really had to narrow my data down to the most frequent birds, and we narrowed down the areas in the Santa Catalinas, the time periods that we wanted, and even getting that, I had I think I ended up with like 7 spreadsheets of just data from iNaturalist. So I really had to go in and really pick which ones would provide the most data and just kind of take it one step at a time. Let's look at birds in general, based on these stratifications, what happened to them before looking forward into specific areas, different types of birds in different elevations compared to other mountain ranges. It was a really close call to what do we look at first.
I think you also touched on something in your talk, which I recall kind of as we were first looking at it, you just sort of downloaded all the data from, you said 48 species, and we just kind of looked at it all, and you're just looking at a graph, but your eyes crossed over because there's just data. So I think it's right in that one challenge is just kind of thinking critically about how to organize it, because there is so much data. It could easily become overwhelming to figure out how to pull out trends and how to address interesting questions with it. But we talked it through and figured out those stratifications that made it all kind of made sense.
Rebecca, go ahead.
So I'm curious about just how much you considered the limitations of iNaturalist, because you know, one thing that also happened in addition to affecting species that lived on the mountains is that that hikers were limited from areas for a while. And so if iNaturalist is depending on, you know, hikers and average people to get out there and document these species, and then, you know, the hikers were restricted, then how did you think through, like, if the effects you were seeing were on restrictions of visitors or really effects on wildlife?
So that was definitely a consideration, because the most of the counties were blocked off from June to July because of that fire. When we looked at the following year to compare the data, we also blocked out that period, knowing that the summer in general did not have a lot of observations. And really looking forward over a year, now we're getting into 2 years since the fire, really looking at that recovery trend, if we are seeing species still very low after all of these hikers and bird watchers have returned, that's really indicative that it did have an impact. It's not just for lack of observations.
And we talked about some next steps that Isabel could take that she alluded to, is, you know, looking at other mountain ranges that have been impacted by fire and haven't had those same closures, or if you could pull out kind of the same trends in the Santa Ritas or the Rincons or any of those, that would be a really great comparator, but we just ran out of time.
Yeah, it's a big undertaking. And I guess that you know, the same question kind of sits in my mind too with some of these other mountain ranges, because the Rincons are known for being inaccessible. And so you don't have quite the same foot traffic that you have, you know, in a place like the Catalinas, where we have the nice highway that we can just drive up. So, you know, I think there's just a lot of things to think through when we're using this community science data, because it's reliant on volunteers, right, to participate. So it's very powerful indeed. And I'm glad that you were able to kind of adjust the data and look at certain times, the June, July periods that you knew that you wouldn't be able to compare. So thanks for offering that as insight into like a workaround, right? Of how to get by those things. And that's where that critical thinking, Molly, that you're talking about really plays in.
Yeah, you know, I think it's a really great example too, because, you know, so me working in wildfire, there's very little questions we can answer with like this experimental design that you learn about in kind of traditional science classes. And so there, all of those sort of,
I'm trying to come up with
we have to think through all the time, all those kind of confounding variables when we're studying some of these large scale events. And so I think it's a really great, it's a great teaching tool, I think, to kind of think do that kind of critical thinking with students on these like big data sets, because so little of our science is really that kind of perfectly designed experiment inside the laboratory. I mean, that certainly happens in some fields, but very, very infrequently does it happen in ecology.
And this is, I just want to sort of follow up on that and reiterate again, it's so important. I think we can feel overwhelmed as instructors and as students with those huge data sets, but any data that we get is not necessarily just the answer. And you said it, Molly, to think critically about the data. So I think that's something that we're all, I think it's kind of a result of the pandemic. We've been able to sit with data a little more, I think, or we've been more reliant on virtual sources to get data. And And just the idea that don't take it at first value and play with it, you know, break it apart, look at it different ways, and really explore what other patterns and trends are there that that might not pop out initially. I had one quick question, Isabel. Just I played around with iNaturalist this last week, and I learned how to download the data sets. Did you download the data sets in CSVs, or did you just take data directly from that and make your own Excel files?
I actually took the data directly. I looked at downloading a couple, but because I could only use the research grade and it had to be specific time periods, and I ended up not taking all of the species, only the ones that had multiple observations. It was just maybe possibly easier to do it by hand. It ended up being a lot of work, but it's it's good to know that you can use the CSVs. I've downloaded that before and used like RStudio to make the graphs, but I did do it by hand this time, just because there were so many stratifications and filters. I didn't want to mess it all up.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful to know that there's lots of options for how to gather the data too. So I certainly would love for any teachers and students and guests who are here to ask questions. I guess you could raise your little cartoon hand or just speak up. Sarah says in the chat, great presentation. Mr. Santos, hello and welcome, please.
Hi, so I came in late because I was driving home after work. So I just want, because I never heard about the iNaturalist. I just want to know, is it web-based or application used in phone?
Both.
Both, okay.
I believe it's both, yeah.
It is both.
Because I think you can, and I don't have the app, but I think, you know, that allows you to take if you're out in the field and you want to contribute data to it, you can take a picture and whatever you're seeing and upload it. Oh, there you go.
There's my little, I have 57 observations. It's not so great, but I can upload, I have pictures on my phone that I need to upload. Mr. Santos, I was out in the mountains for quite a while and I didn't get that much, but I got some. So I have it on my phone, but I also access it on the computer. It's a global, it's a worldwide, it's phenomenal. I forgot, aren't there close to 1 trillion? I don't know, it's over 1 billion. There's just so much data, so many observations on there. And most of them are photographs, but there's also recordings now. Both Rebecca and I practiced and we uploaded mockingbird recordings and other things. So you can identify by vocalization as well. And I believe Isabel mentioned you could put videos on there. And there was one other thing I was going to add, but it fell out of my brain. So
if I could add with iNaturalist, it is really easy with the app to take photos and add it to your own observations. But to get into the types of things that Isabel was doing, where you're like needing to filter out data and put some constraints on data that you want to download, that's something that you would do on a PC, because you know, there are more options when you access it via the web. And to be able to just kind of handle those large amounts of data, you would need to use the website interface to do that. So there are more options when you use it online using a computer compared to just using the app, which is primarily to be able to make and download observations into your own profile.
Yes, and I just went and I put the link in the chat. So there's 93,970,390 observations, representing 3,444 or 344,098 species. So there's a lot.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So does it only include animals or including plants too? Oh, wow.
All plants and any living creatures that
Oh,
can be
that's
recorded. And also you can also record evidence.
That's
of
what I
living
was going to
things.
say earlier. That's what
So,
fell out of my brain.
there are people that have added pictures of scat, right? So animal poop that you can help to identify creatures. As Margaret mentioned just a little bit ago, sound, and Isabel mentioned sound as well. So some of the observations might be a recording of a bird call.
And also track.
So Isabel, in the chat, Sarah also had a question of, does iNaturalist identify the birds by group or feeding type? Or was that additional research that you needed to do to kind of categorize and look at those trends?
That was an additional thing. I used the Cornell lab for that. Going through iNaturalist, I wasn't able to look at, say, like feeding groups specifically. The most I could narrow it down to was type of species, and you can search in there for a specific species if you want to just look at that, but that's as specific as I could get it, especially with all of the other filters that I had going on. Because when you upload an observation, you don't necessarily need to know its habitat or feeding trends or nesting behavior, and you don't really label that when you upload an observation. And so that's not readily available when I downloaded those off of iNaturalist.
That's a great question, because that then shows how other online databases can complement each other, and you can get different information from different sites, and very resourceful.
Can you talk a little bit more, Isabel, about your decision to choose birds? You mentioned that they're a little more easily identifiable. And one thing that occurred to me is that, of course, birds can move a lot more easily in elevation or in spaces than other animals can. And so, so in thinking about the effects of the wildfire, I mean, certainly the birds have the ability to leave an area more easily. And one would think they could come back just as easily. So I'm curious about just the implications of you not seeing the levels kind of bouncing back, and what you can infer from that given the mobility of these birds.
Yeah, so that's why looking at the effects of firefighting made it difficult, because for that I would prefer to like look at the elevation specifically and the path of the fire. Like you mentioned, birds move a lot. That's why I looked at the Catalinas as a whole and in general observations. So if they were moving from different elevations, just different areas in general, they would still be counted as long as they were in that same mountain range. Of course, the decreases in number of observations or populations doesn't necessarily have to contribute to species dying. It could be migration. It's just in general, the levels in the Catalinas as a whole are not quite the same.
Isabel, I was curious. I'm sort of sitting here trying to think of what cavity nesters, do you remember specific species? Because that, I remember from your presentation, was one group that didn't seem to come back. And I don't know if you remember which species. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you know.
I do not remember off the top of my head, but I can try to get my spreadsheet open. It's kind of the only thing I've been working on for the past several months. I have, okay, I got it up actually pretty easily.
Awesome.
Woodpeckers are cavity nesters. I have a couple wrens, the nuthatches, and flycatchers are in my cavity category.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Huh.
I found that finding really surprising, because it's opposite what we typically think happens in fires. You know, after fire, you get a lot of dead trees, a lot of standing dead trees. That's what woodpeckers love. So they tend to flock to burn areas. So that it wasn't what I was expecting.
Yeah, that's actually the first time I've looked at the specific species in that category. I did not realize that, but again, like Rebecca had mentioned, that might be due to just not many hikers are going through the areas with burned wood. Maybe they're looking at greener areas where there are less woodpeckers now, because maybe they all went to the burnt areas. So we're just not seeing as many. Kind of a what's the word? Kind of a con of citizen research. There's probably less observations in that area. But yeah, that is definitely really interesting.
Yeah. And to Rebecca's point, they might have been the areas that were closed. I mean, because that also those areas, the snags, that's where they fall, and they can fall on people. And that's a danger. So that might have been the part of the forest that was closed for longer. And you're right, it's not necessarily very pleasant to hike through a completely burned forest. So.
Well, I wondered too about food sources though, right? So maybe there's habitat for a nest, but if they don't have adequate food sources.
Yeah, well, what often happens is you get all these wood bearing insects that are under the bark. And so it's a feeding frenzy for woodpeckers, usually those really high intensity burned areas.
Yeah, because the insects move in too. I mean, there's
those wood
borers.
Wood borers, yeah.
So Molly, as a researcher who's focused on wildfire, were there any other results that were surprising to you, or things that were just unexpected?
Yeah, well then, you know, the group of species that you found recovered were the ground nesters, which I also found really surprising, because oftentimes, you know, fire it pretty uniformly influences the surface, and that means influencing burning up the nests that are on the ground, or burning up the nests that might be in the shrubs. So those species tend to be pretty heavily impacted by fire, and it could take a while for them to come back. But so that was surprising too, that was the group of species that seemed to bounce back. But again, we don't know what kind of vegetation that was in. Was that in kind of grasslands or in the desert, or we don't quite know. So, but
yeah, looking at it now, I'm going back to all of the raw data. The woodpeckers are also classified as bark foragers when you look at behavior, and that is the group that increased the most since the fire. So that shows the more expected trend, but just when grouped with the nuthatches and what was it, flycatchers,
right,
then it's a general downward trend. Yeah.
So maybe that could be why. Oh.
I don't know, just different stratifications just showed. I definitely want to look more into that. That's really interesting.
Exactly. So many new questions come out when you start to explore the data. That's awesome. Any other, I know we have a number of other teachers here. Have other people used iNaturalist in the past, or have any experience or questions about, how to get started? SARSEF is here, of course, to support. We can match mentors and students. We can also support whole classes in research projects. So something like iNaturalist, or some of the other citizen data or citizen science sites might be really perfect for a long-term class project. And we would be happy to help teachers and classes with that. So, if a question doesn't pop into your head right now, please be sure to follow up. I am Margaret at sarsef.org. It's real easy to just reach out, but I don't know, Kathy or Ty, Sarah, are you a teacher or a student?
I've not used it before, if that's what I heard you asking.
Yeah. And okay, Sarah, great. You're a teacher from the Phoenix area. So Ty, you haven't used it?
No, I've not.
They'll have to get you out there using it. Get your students out there.
Yeah, I haven't used it yet either, but
Mhm.
I'm interested in seeing, you know, where I might be able to put that into my classes.
I think it's an awesome resource, Kathy. I think you'd really enjoy it.
Margaret, can you talk a little bit too about, so Margaret and I actually just did a workshop for teachers this past Saturday, so this is all very fresh in our minds as well. And we've talked about what Isabel did at the high school level of like downloading, you know, some pretty specific data and having pretty big data sets. But there are other options for ways to pursue projects with younger students as well, or projects that could be a little bit more simplified. And so and you had shared some ideas of that in relation to maybe phenology or even just activities looking at local species in different areas and how common different species were.
Yeah, well, for the workshop that we did, I just thought, well, I was kind of foiled that I was going to do like how many you know, wildcats, bobcats are seen in Pima County versus Maricopa County. And then I thought, surely there's an organism somewhere in the world named a sun devil, but there isn't. It's not on iNaturalist as a common name anyway. So I couldn't quite follow through with my little thing, but comparison. But it was very interesting just to look at, without going into much detail at all, just looking at how the number of bobcat sightings in those two counties. And then I just showed a map that had the distribution of sites, and there were so many questions that came up. And number one, there were so many more observations in Pima County. It was over twice or almost 3 times as many. And you know, of course, we have the mountains so close and the foothills and corridors through our city, and we started talking about that because all the Phoenix observations were really on the edges of Phoenix and not in central Phoenix. And so I think, you know, younger students can just look at a map of 2 locations and look at like the number of observations and start to ask lots of questions about why. I mean, you can ask it about why are the animals there, and then also why are the observations there, because clearly that's where the people are too, because we can't have a data point if a person doesn't submit it to iNaturalist, right? So, and then also, oh, go ahead.
That raises a question for me, right? Like if you're saying there's all these sightings of the bobcats in Tucson, is iNaturalist precise enough to identify when it's the same animal? And because like you have that comparison, I'm going to guess out here in the Winchesters, we probably have a higher bobcat population, but it's what you just said. You don't have the people present to record those sightings.
Good observation. Good. That's a really good point, Ty. And that's why we have to be careful with how we, you know, what conclusions we draw from the data that we do use from citizen science. Because I mean, I'm not the greatest hiker in the world, but I try to take some hikes and some challenging hikes. And I know just in general, like most people maybe go a mile, you know, I mean, the general population that's going out, maybe they go a mile down a trail and then come back. And so there are people like I don't know what's in the Rincons, because the Rincons, you're right, Rebecca mentioned that earlier, there's no roads in the Rincons. You have to hike. If you want to get to Manning Camp, you gotta walk a long ways uphill. So it is going to bias our observations, but still there's a lot of fabulous questions that can be asked about that, because, you know, right, I mean, just our intersection with wildlife, you know. And
is it sensitive enough though for that?
Say it again.
Do you think, like, is iNaturalist sensitive enough to do that, to be able to distinguish unique specimens?
No, because it's based just on you know, my photo, your photo. Probably not. I mean, maybe if a bobcat was being sighted in one geographic location over and over and over again, and you wanted to painstakingly go through those photos and try to match specific unique traits, you know, like people do with with jaguars and other like spotted cats where they can recognize distinct patterns. But I mean, that's possible, but you'd certainly have to have lots of photos to be able to do that.
Sure.
Yeah, I
didn't question.
I can think of one example here in Tucson is that Sweetwater wetlands. There's a very established bobcat population there, and a number of the frequent visitors there have learned to tell them apart. And so they're, you know, and people who have gone year after year after year are able to kind of identify who they believe at least is a parent versus offspring of different bobcats there. But I'm gonna just show you real quick, if you haven't seen what projects look like in iNaturalist, this might give you a little bit of context as well, is that this is from last year's City Nature Challenge in Tucson. It was a much smaller project, but you can look at the observations, which gives you all of the observations submitted. You can look at just the species that were documented, and it tells you how many observations per species are documented, and you can go in and access those specific observations submitted for this project. And you can see how many people made those observations. And so, you know, that's where you can start picking apart the data a little bit, right? Of like how many people are making these observations. Like Margaret said, when she compared Tucson to Phoenix, she didn't just look at the number of bobcats. She was also taking into consideration the number of people that had made those observations. So you can look at the observers as well and start just breaking these things down in a little bit of a different way. There's nothing to restrict somebody from going out and taking 50 pictures of a cactus and submitting them all from one little area. You know, in general, I don't think that happens a lot. I think people are in general documenting things that they just, you know, catch their eye or notice that are interesting, or they want to document their hike and the things that they see in that time. But you can go through and you can see, you know, how many different people made observations of a particular species when it was observed. So, you know, when we start talking about phenology or even just patterns throughout the day, right? When are people more frequently making observations of specific species? So are they commonly seen in the middle of the day, morning, nighttime, even overnight? Some people use game cameras that are triggering overnight observations. Then you can look at location as well. And so there's quite a robust record, right, for each of these things. You can also look at the individual photo and see if there's any additional information you can get from that. So, you know, some species might have different colors during different times of the year. Certainly with flowering plants, you can see if there's a flower there or not, or think of this life cycle stage, right?
So to follow up on that, Rebecca, you could, there's ecological interactions that students can look at, because a lot of the insects, especially the bees, the Hymenoptera, they're on plants, on flowering plants. So you can maybe ask some questions about, you know, which plants they visit and pollination, that sort of thing. And other questions that students could ask is like proximity to roads or to water or to, you know, I mean, like the wetlands, the Sweetwater wetlands here in Tucson, as you mentioned, Rebecca, when we zoomed in on the wildcats, it was just like, there were like stacks and stacks and stacks of dots on Sweetwater. So yeah.
Okay, that's the only place I've gotten a picture of a bobcat too. So like many people in Tucson. But I want to bring it back to Isabel. So Isabel, how did you decide what your project topic would be and really like narrow it in? Because I mean, we've talked about so many questions around your question. How did you start and just narrow it in on that particular question in the beginning?
So Dr. Hunter helped with that a lot. Star Lab asked for my research interests, and like Margaret mentioned, last year I did green infrastructure, more microbial, and this year I was like, wildlife, give me animals. And they gave me Molly. And being a wildfire specialist, she suggested the Bighorn Fire. I personally live out in Vale, and so my house was covered in smoke during the Bighorn Fire. And so that was a huge thing. I was like, yes, Bighorn Fire, that sounds awesome. And then looking through all of it and just seeing all of the species, that's when we really started saying, hey, look at all of these birds. Like maybe these birds specifically impacted by the fire. And it was kind of just pieced together like that, like which step. But the Bighorn Fire was particularly Molly's idea. And really glad I went with it, because after that I was like, yes, we're looking at the Bighorn Fire, which was really exciting.
I love your enthusiasm, and I just have to, because I think I'm the only person that might be aware of this. We have two students, and we have Isabel and then also Andrea Romero from Harvest Prep, and they are both, were both ISEF finalists last year. So that means they were selected from SARSEF to represent Southern Arizona at the International Science and Engineering Fair. So that's just such a huge honor. And you're both two of the most enthusiastic and well-spoken young scientists that I've had the pleasure to work with. So I just want to thank you and just give a shout out to you for all the work that you do and share with all of us, because you make what we do so meaningful. And I thank you.
So I'm curious then, for either Isabel or Andrea, has doing a project and going to the International Science Fair influenced kind of your career path or your interest in what you want to do moving forward?
I definitely can say 100% yes. One, I got to meet all of these researchers through SARSEF, and then going to ISEF, meeting. I have now friends on my Instagram and LinkedIn page from Egypt and China and the Philippines, which is just amazing. And you get to see all of that science and getting to look at like the different projects and stuff. I was definitely, oh, look at this project. And then you see that all the projects I've looked at have been looking at wildlife. I've been looking at animals. I've been looking at mammals. I'm like, oh, okay, that's definitely my interest. And especially like the U of A and getting to work with them. The U of A funded my college education through ISEF. So that's definitely a major thing. I've gotten offers to work in labs, and it's just definitely, I would have probably very little planning for what to do next if I hadn't done 3 years of research through SARSEF. So that for me, that is absolutely definitely guided by SARSEF.
That's great. And as somebody who works with undergraduate research at the U of A, we're really lucky to have you and other young people that have worked with SARSEF. And I know Margaret and I are working on more of a connection to help students that participate in SARSEF to then find those resources at the University of Arizona, to be able to find a place to do research and jump into that right away. Because we know that students that get experience in their first and second year of college doing research are much more likely to stick with it than having to wait until you're a junior or senior and maybe getting experience at that point. So that's really fortunate that you've had that. And you've got to learn that people like Molly Hunter are just people and not scary professors. So you already have an advantage. Andrea, did you want to talk about your experience? That would be great.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone. And hi Ms. Margaret. Thank you for the words. I really appreciate it. I was not able to hear everything because my internet's like not working right now. It's not the best. But first, before anything else, I just want to say that Isabel did a great job on her presentation. That was really wonderful. Even though I was not able to hear like the last part, I did hear most of it, and it was really good. I just have one question for her before I start talking about my experience with SARSEF and everything. And I mean, I just think that she's so young to be doing like all of these wonderful things. Like I just heard her presentation and I was amazed. So I just want to hear from her, like what she thinks, what's the like hardest part of her research? Like what did she struggle the most?
That's an awesome question. You are so sweet, Andrea. I love whenever we get to like present together. Um, so definitely a struggle sometimes with, for me, it's when research gets a little boring. I started my research in the pandemic, 100% online. And that's when my mentor didn't really feel much like a person. It was kind of, I spent, through the Keys internship, I was 8 hours a day on a computer coding. That was all of my research. And that was kind of really like doubtful, like, is this worth doing? Like, am I even getting any results? I've done so many research projects that just end in, well, I don't know. It just doesn't add up right. And that's just kind of discouraging. Like, well, what's this? Like, is the science thing really worth it? And then you get to meet people through Star Lab and go to ISEF, and you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely really cool. We actually get results and things like that. So that's probably for me, like being like so young. I was 15 when I was first accepted into the Keys program. I just turned 16 by the start of it. That was definitely a kind of, I have no idea what I'm doing with my life. Let's see where research goes. But yeah, that's probably what was hardest for me.
And Andrea, will you tell us a little bit? We're like give you a couple of minutes to share your experience, because we're just so fortunate to hear from both of you. So your ISEF
Yeah,
experience and
yeah, I love to. Actually, I like to talk a lot of my about my experience in SARSEF. So last year was my first time participating in SARSEF, and actually I was very successful. I got to be first place in health and biomedical science, and also I was the finalist. So I got the opportunity to attend to ISEF. But I think that just like Isabel, one of the barriers was due to COVID. So I was not able to experience like that full experience and the trail of actually going into a like a well not virtual science fair. But in overall, just like Isabel said, the competition was very exciting, and also that you get the opportunity to meet new people. Like for example, me, I love to learn about new cultures, about people, and just learn something new. So aside from doing what you like I mean science and about research projects, you also get to meet those people. And for example, me, I got to meet people from Brazil, from Egypt, from people everywhere, really around the world. And that's actually so how can I don't even know like how to describe it, because it was really a fun experience. And up until today I still talk to them, and not only like just to chat and have fun, but also about learning new stuff. So they have helped me on making research, like some questions that I had, and they have helped me, as well as for example with math or just really anything. And so you create really strong bonds with other people.
thank you, Andrea. I always think of it as it's kind of like, I think,
Yeah.
world peace through science. Actually, when I'm part of ISEF and these international events, I am so inspired and moved by the young people from all over the world that just want us to have a better life and a better planet. So thank you. We are a little over, and I know everyone's very busy and has spent a lot of time on Zoom. I want to thank Dr. Hunter, Molly Hunter, for being an awesome mentor and for spending this hour with us. And to Isabel, thank you for being an amazing student and young scientist and spending this hour. And thank you to all our guests for being here, and to Rebecca for pulling us all together. this is fabulous, and I hope we all will be out there with our new iNaturalist apps on our phones, and go for it, Yuma. You guys are saying, Mr. Santos, now you have to start something over there at Yuma, and you guys got the Colorado and the wetlands. I was just talking to someone who was in the wetlands over there, Wetlands East or something. I don't know. I just heard about it today, and they were just saying how happy the birds are there. So, but thank you all, and we will be back next Tuesday, right? Next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And Rebecca mentioned this word phenology. We'll be with Dr. Teresa Crimmins, who is the head of the National Phenology Network, which is a national network that records sort of life histories. Like, it's kind of a database that looks at when are plants flowering, when are insects, and when are butterflies emerging, and when are caterpillars, like, marching across the roads in huge numbers or not. So it's sort of the timing of life histories, and you can tie that to climate change and lots of other things. I think there's lots of interesting potential there. So hope to see you next week, same time. And then I think the last one's on, are they on? It's the 19th. What is today? So maybe.
Yeah, so the last one also is on Tuesday, on April 26th.
Okay.
With Dr. Katie Prudek.
Mm-hmm.
She's the co-director of eButterfly, and she also utilizes community science data in her own research. And just as a point, she is somebody that can talk about getting community science data from remote locations, because she's actually tapped into specific community science forums where they actually advertise to people who are doing like backcountry hiking and expeditions, and they actually pull them into collecting some data while they're out there. And so there are definitely ways to get better access to data that isn't kind of along roads and easy trails to access, and Katie is the person that can talk to us about that specifically. But please reach out to myself or Margaret if you have any questions about how to participate using iNaturalist, City Nature Challenge, or the SARSEF Science Fair. Yay!
Yeah, and Star Lab. Right. All right. Thank you all very much. Have a great evening, and I hope we see you next week. Thank you. Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great.